Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. I'm your host, Megan Lewis, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Professor A.J. Levine. Professor Levine is the Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at the Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. She's been awarded various grants, including by the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the American Council of Learned Studies, in addition to receiving 3 audiences with Pope Francis. Today, we're talking about her upcoming presentation, at a conference on New Testament scholarship aimed explicitly at a non-specialist lay audience. The conference is called New Insights in the New Testament, and it's on September 23rd and 24th. It will include 10 amazing academics and costs only $59.95. If you sign up before Saturday, August 26th, then you will be able to get that for the price of $49.95. All the details, including the names of those amazing scholars and the titles of their talks, can be found over at www.newinsightsconference.org. We have an affiliate link if you're going to sign up. Please consider using it because the donations we get via that really do help us maintain the channel. I know we've not been putting out an awful lot lately, but that's because everyone has been very busy working on research projects, which means buying essentially lots and lots of books and reading lots and lots of books. So hopefully we'll have some more content coming out for you soon. But without further ado, let's welcome AJ. So you're author and editor of a multiple number of books. I was interested also to see that you've written several children's books.
Oh yeah, get them early, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's wonderful. I did want to briefly ask before we got into the topic of the day, what prompted you to start children's writing?
Oh, because so much stuff that's written for Christian children is just dreadful. It's either boring, or I mean, it's really quite boring. A lot of it's quite anti-Jewish, so it plays on certain stereotypes. And I thought, I'm an historian. I'm also a mom, so I thought we could do better. I have a very, very good friend named Sandy Eisenberg Sasso, who is herself a professional children's book author. She's also a rabbi. So I was lamenting to Sandy one day. I was in yet another church on a Sunday morning doing adult education programs, and I'm looking at the children's books going, oh my God, this is terrible. So Sandy said, why don't you stop lamenting and let's write a book? So we did. And then we had a hell of a time trying to get this thing published because,
Really?
the Jewish woman scholar and the rabbi Jewish, right, obviously Jewish, presses didn't want to deal with us. One press we went to said, well, it might confuse the children to have Jews writing about Jesus. We're writing for 3 to 7-year-olds. They don't really worry about the Christology of the authors.
No.
But finally, my very good friend, Elizabeth Caldwell, who does work professionally in Christian children's literature, gave us a suggestion of calling Westminster John Knox. And within 24 hours, we had a contract.
Amazing.
So, good for the PCUSA on this one.
Absolutely. That's, I have to say, hearing the explanation, I'm not surprised that you had a hell of a time getting it published, but I'm glad that you did finally manage to. So you're going to be speaking at an upcoming conference on New Testament scholarship. For those who aren't aware of it, it's aimed at a non-specialist lay audience and is called New Insights in the New Testament. All the details will be running across the bottom of the screen and in the description for the video. And you are speaking on Jesus and women, distinguishing history from apologetic. I have the description. So that Jesus was a first century feminist amid a Jewish world that made the Taliban look progressive, a belief still proclaimed in churches both liberal and conservative, is not only historically inaccurate, it is one of several anti-Semitic tropes that remain in popular preaching and teaching. This presentation, using the Gospels and other literary and archaeological sources, recovers the diverse roles of first century CE Jewish women and I don't think I've got that word right. Sorry. Resuscitates Jesus in terms of an historically grounding understanding of gender and sexuality, which is both good news for Jews and Christians. Before we get specifically into your talk, could you share a little bit about what your background is and what got you into New Testament studies?
My background is I grew up in a Roman Catholic neighborhood and, among other things, got accused of killing God, which also gives a sense of how old I am because the Catholic Church changed in 1965 on that one. But I came in before that, and I couldn't figure out how this tradition, which was my friend's tradition, which seemed to me from the outside quite a lovely tradition, was saying horrible things about me. So I started going to Catholic religious education classes.
Fantastic.
I don't know, kept looking at this material. And then when I eventually went to college, I majored in religion and English, right? And then I went to graduate school and got a PhD in New Testament, figuring that if that didn't work and nobody was going to hire me, because boy, hiring a Jewish woman to teach New Testament in the 80s was not kind of, on the radar of most people. I thought I'd just go to law school. But I got a job, and then I got another job, and then I got tenure, so it seems to have worked pretty well. What I'm interested in doing is getting rid of all of this anti-Jewish junk, which is the technical term, that comes into New Testament studies, based not on history, and actually not based on very good theology either, but based on certain forms of Christian apologetic. And it comes from evangelical and fundamentalist circles. And it also comes from quite liberal circles as well, because everybody's trying to make Jesus the hero, or in the liberal sense, the social justice warrior. And the easiest way to do that is to make the Jewish context look so negative that anything that he says becomes progressive, or, to use the word of the day, radical. And what that does theologically is yank him out of his Jewish context entirely, and that's denying the sense of Jesus as being a fully human individual, which means embedded within history. It's anti-Semitic, which is also bad theology. It's bad history, and I don't think you can build a good church on the basis of bad history.
So, what prompted you to look at the women in and around Jesus and the New Testament that we'll be going into for your presentation?
Yeah. Well, I'm a graduate of a women's college, Smith College, which is still a women's college. And I was very interested in how women were kind of ignored when I was in high school. We had presidents and generals and whatnot, and everyone, and you get like Queen Elizabeth I and Harriet Tubman, and that was about it. And I thought, well, who are these women? And then I started reading all of this literature about how women were oppressed and suppressed and repressed in early Judaism. And then Jesus comes along and invents feminism. And for a while, I believed it because I was being told that by people who were publishing with reputable presses and people with PhDs. And then I went off to graduate school to look at this, and I got the same message. And then I had one of those aha moments, which is sometimes called the hermeneutics of suspicion. And I thought, can this really be true? I mean, was Judaism that awful? Because I knew from my own tradition, boy, we had books named after women like Ruth and Esther, and we had prophets like Miriam and Deborah. I mean, so where was all this junk coming from? And I found it wasn't coming from good history. It was coming from bad apologetic. So I went back and I started looking. When I was in graduate school, and I went to Duke, and I got to graduate school in the fall of 1978, because again, I'm old. And I said to the faculty, there not a single senior woman on the faculty at the time in Bible. I said, I want to work on women. And the faculty said, well, that's kind of faddish. Why don't you work on justification and Paul? And I thought, well, that's kind of been done. So I got through, and then I got my first job at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. And I said to the senior faculty, all men, I'd really like to work on women. They said, we're not sure you can get tenure with that, write on something else. So only when I got tenure did I start looking more formally, both at the role of women and by extension, questions of gender and sexuality. Now, it's not as if men are lacking gender or lacking sexuality, but those particular questions tended to get lumped together with questions of women's history. And I thought, if I continue to do this, and I have continued to do this, I can recover the role of first century Jewish women, which is good for me as a 21st century Jewish woman. I can correct these unfortunate stereotypes, and I can extend that to talk about how else people have been hurt because of particular ways of reading the Bible when it comes to gender performance or when it comes to sexual expression. So what
if you're trying,
can I just say one more thing?
Please carry. Yeah.
Is put my very good scholarship, I think I was very well trained, in the service of forms of liberation today, to actually make the text sound like good news rather than we hate you, or you're damned, or you're abnormal.
Thank you. I think that's a very important scholarship and excellent aims. When you're trying then to recover the historical truth fact of what life was like for women in first century Jewish communities, how do you go about doing that, and what kinds of evidence do you have to work with?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's not like we have anything direct. I mean, it would be nice if I could say that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all written by women. We don't know who wrote these texts. and it's very hard to locate any sort of women's literature, because women back then may well have hidden behind men's names, as people did up to, like J.K. Rowling, right? Or George Eliot. So what I do is I begin with the New Testament, because people will say to me, oh, you're just engaging in some sort of apologetic, prove it. And since I'm talking to Christians, I figure I'll start with the Gospels. That seems like a pretty good start. And try to figure out what roles do the Gospels think that women have? Like they have access to their own funds, and they have freedom of travel, and they show up in synagogues, and they show up in the Jerusalem temple. They show up in public, and nobody ever faints. We have examples of women as prophets. We can get that in the Pauline literature, and in Acts with Philip's daughters. And then I can go to external sources. So historians like Josephus, philosophers like Philo of Alexandria, and try to figure out what they're doing, not just using women as symbolic capital, like woman wisdom, but what do they think that women can actually do? I can look at Roman sources, because first century Judea and Galilee, they're under Roman rule, whether by a client king in the north or whether direct Roman rule in the south. And figure out, well, what did Romans allow at the time? I can look at literature like trade documents. And so we've got most of this stuff from Egypt to figure out, well, I've got women here involved in pottery making and in textile work. So how did women make their living? We can look at marriage contracts. And we've got some from the early 2nd century, which are really quite helpful, from the Bar Kokhba papyri, to figure out how women are functioning in the court system. I can go to the diaspora and look at inscriptional work, whether it's epitaphs or synagogue inscriptions or so on. And what you do is you use whatever sources you can, trying to control for history, trying to control for class, because most of the stuff we have comes from the upper classes, which also means, by the way, looking at women who are enslaved and not just free women and not just rich women. And trying to figure out, well, how are they being treated? What are their options? The first century was a patriarchal androcentric system. So, by the way, is the 21st century. But the question is, first of all, how bad was it? What are the parameters in which these people could work? And then the second question is, what does Jesus do, if anything, to change those particular parameters? And here's where it's helpful to go from just what do women do to questions of things like gender and sexuality. Because if, for example, Jesus is a celibate, which I think he is, well, that's going to say something about women and men in his groups. Are they pair bonding, husband and wife, or are they mother and brothers and sisters, sibling relationships? Is the most important thing for Jesus that women get married and have babies? I don't think so. Well, what does that say about infertile women or divorced women, or women who choose not to have children for whatever reason? So I think with this kind of effusive way of looking at whatever source I can get my hand on, and then using whatever tool is going to get me there, and hear new questions, because new approaches give rise to new concerns, social memory theory, or different views of archaeology, or cross-cultural comparison for revitalization movements, whatever that stuff is. And then you try to put it all together and see if you get something where you can have not just one datum, but lots of different data that all seem to come to some sort of coherent whole.
Thank you. And there'll obviously be a lot more detail in your presentation in September. And the last question I wanted to ask before I let you go, when you're doing this kind of work, how are you able, and is it difficult to separate out the kind of Christian apologetics that you see, especially in modern understandings of the gospel, from what was going on, historically speaking, on the ground?
When I would come home from elementary school when I was a kid, my mother would ask me, the first thing she would say to me is, did you ask any good questions today? And then we would talk about what I learned. And on occasion, she would say to me, well, how do you know that? What's your evidence for that? And I think what a really good question that is. And that's something that I try to encourage my students to ask. How do you know this? So some great scholar says X. Okay, well, how does he know? How does he know that? And then you run down the footnotes and you find out if the footnotes, if there are any, and sometimes there aren't. Sometimes people just say stuff off the top of their head. So you run down the footnotes and you look up the sources. Very frequently, for example, some of this apologetic material will go to a rabbinic document. and cite a rabbinic document, and they'll get the citation correct, but they'll ignore what comes immediately before and what comes immediately after, because the rabbis typically say, well, there's this, and then there's that, and then there's a third thing. So you try to avoid that way of saying, I'm just going to take the evidence that supports me and ignore everything else. You have to take it as an entire package. And then you say, can you use rabbinic literature and backtrack into early first century Galilee? Only with great difficulty. So then we try to figure out, are the rabbis writing from a 4th century perspective in Babylon, or are they writing from a 1st century perspective in the land of Israel? So I'm always asking, how do you know that? And I'm asking that of myself as well. So if I have an idea, do I have at least 3 items that are going to support it? Because if it's only 2, it's pretty weak. And if it's only 1, it's really, really weak. So you do the best you can. And then this is one of the things that I think Bart Ehrman does really well, is you put your stuff out there, not only to a popular audience, but to other scholars. And you say, does this make sense to you? So before I publish something, I send it out to people I trust, and often people who know more about a particular subject area than I do, saying, does this make sense to you? What am I missing? Where are the holes in my argument? And that's what keeps good scholarship honest, and it keeps honest scholarship good.
Well, thank you so much, AJ, for sharing your time and telling us about your work and what we can expect from the conference. The conference is on the 23rd and 24th of September. So again, there will be information about that in the description of the video. Thank you again. And I look forward to seeing your presentation.
Thanks very much, Megan.
I hope you all enjoyed that brief teaser into AJ Levine's presentation. Again, if you are interested in attending the conference, it's September 23rd and 24th. You can find out more at www.newinsightsconference.org. That's all today from Digital Hammurabi. Thank you to AJ Levine. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to ask, how do you know that? Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/digitalhammurabi to see how you can help.